Okay, so welcome everybody back after Thanksgiving. I hope you had a lot of time to eat, family and fun time. So this year, the SEC committee and myself are trying to implement 4 faculty scholarship development programs, and this is the first in our series. And so the topic today is literature reviews. And just to let you know where the information is located, in KCON Connect, it's the very last item on the bottom, faculty scholarship development. And then we have it set up so every date that we have one will have its own folder. So you can just click on that if you would like any of the materials. And both the handouts and the PowerPoint are in this folder. So they're available to all faculty, and you can share them with any students you feel would benefit from the information. There are also hard copies of the handouts back there, and we have a wonderful grant. I didn't even tell you yet, Karen. Over the weekend, we got an FTLC grant to purchase food and photocopying for our series of 4 developments. Wow. So we thank them for the popcorn and apples. We're trying to be healthy. Any questions then before I get started?
No, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to turn the lights on, otherwise it'll be too dark for the recording.
Okay, so I think everyone knows me, Sandy Spoolstra. And today I'm going to talk about Literature Reviews 101, Why and How. And if you already peeked at the presentation, you can see there's almost 60 slides in it, so I'm not going to review all of the slides, but I put specific information in some of the slides so at least you would have it. And I'll just point out to you some of the information. Amelia Grayson, a graduate student in the DMP program, also assisted me with this because she's honing her presentation skills. And so today we're going to talk about how understanding the different types of literature reviews and then how to implement the steps of a review, both identifying via electronic aids and then interpreting what to include in a review, and then how to screen, abstract, critique, and organize it. So I think most of you know literature reviews are organized written summaries of the state of existing published knowledge on a topic. So that's a very generic definition, but I think it actually is pretty good all-encompassing definition because we use different reviews for many different things. So to the best of my knowledge, I could identify 14 different ways of going about doing a review. And so we did do a handout so that you can see the types of reviews and an actual citation where it was a scholarly paper and described in depth. And so I think that kind of helps us all a little bit because what you have a student do in 265 compared to NUR 691 would be somewhat of a different review compared to what they might do in their undergrad or grad end of program project. So there are many different ways to approach how to do a review. So I just listed here, I provided information on all 14. So you have that in the handout, both in Blackboard and the paper that's in front of you. But these are actually the most common types that I personally see in the literature that are published. A meta-analysis, which is a quantitative analysis. It's actually a statistical approach to look at the stats of all studies compiled across a topic. And then the most common, I think, is actually a systematic review, where you have a defined question and you're compiling information from other studies. So the only difference I can see, although it's still somewhat unclear, is what's different about an integrative review, which is actually a form of systematic reviews, is it basically includes qualitative information. And so over the years, I've tried to take that approach. A systematic review doesn't include qualitative, and an integrative review does include qualitative. So, Susan Strauss, would you have a different view of that? No? Similar? Okay. And then also in the literature, you'll see this thing called Realist review, and I have talked a little bit about that before, where it's an inclusion of other studies, but it also includes input from the provider, which I think may be an important component when we're talking about DMP projects, because they're very specific to settings and what's being done in a setting. And then scoping reviews, I've noticed maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years in the literature. And so they seem to have, it's kind of like the Wild West of reviews still. There's not any precise way of viewing these in published literature. But basically they seem to have less emphasis on findings and methods. And they basically profile studies. So after looking into what it was or wasn't, I was kind of left with wondering what's the difference between a realist review and a scoping review. And I'm not sure. So, you know, reviews are used for many different things, just to get information and knowledge about a topic, identifying evidence to improve practice, to write a protocol, procedure, process. Sometimes they're used just to determine gaps. Sometimes it's theory development, sometimes it's primary research, and sometimes they're used to interpret study findings. And by that, I mean, well, people are doing something and they want to see if someone else has done something similar, and if the findings are the same or different. So I look at it as 3 sources of information for reviews. The primary source, which is a written study done by a researcher who's conducted it, usually with a theory, but not always, and sometimes an original idea, and it's written by the person who generated it. But there are a lot of secondary sources where it's a description of a study prepared by someone other than the researcher who conducted it. And there are many, many peripheral sources, which are clinical anecdotes, opinion articles, and case reports. So I basically try to tell students that there's like 18, I think we're up to 18,000 nursing journals now. It's so hard to keep track of all of the information and try to understand it. But I try to look at it as important articles to include, which are seminal studies or landmark studies. So seminal are just the first done on the initiation of something in a field, and then landmark studies are those that mark important turning points in a field. And so those are basically oftentimes the only thing I let students include in papers that are old, because nursing is really changing. Nursing practice is changing so rapidly right now. And so it's also generically, when you think about a review, what is the process? You choose a topic, identify the databases and resources, search and refine, read and analyze, and write the review. But not all reviews of literature need to be written either. So that's not always necessary. Sometimes you're just using it to inform yourself. So I always try to, when I work, especially with students, help them to define the question or topic. And I even did this like when I taught 265. If you don't know what you're really thinking about, then it's unclear what you're searching for. And you'll just be searching forever and ever and ever. So you really need to have a pretty well-defined question or topic. It's not like it doesn't evolve over time. It can change based on the last article you read. Absolutely. But at least you have it like written down so you know exactly what it is. And then I always try to advise people to devise a search strategy where they have their keywords, what they're including and excluding, what search engines they're using, the number of people who are reviewing it, and what their role is. And then I personally like to use a consort figure, which I'll show you in a second. And I find that students that take a more methodical approach to this, no matter what level of education, it seems like they have clearer reviews, because then they know exactly what they're doing and not doing, and so it's more defined. So searching and retrieving primary and secondary sources is just basically screening for relevance, title, abstract, or full article. You can determine in your search strategy how you're going to go about doing that. I always tell students, wait, if you're going to do rounding and you see in the literature there's 8,000 articles. You're not going to read the whole 8,000 articles. So it's kind of driven in a iterative way based on what you're finding. And then basically we discard non-relevant, we find themes and patterns, we critique, analyze, and synthesize, often in tables. And then sometimes, but not always, we write reports. So this is basically a visual depiction of exactly the same thing. But I found that sometimes, especially students, when we're helping them to do this, they need the kind of visual and to see that things are circular within this process, so it's very iterative. So when you're designing a search strategy, I very critically think about what databases I'm using. And thank God we don't have to go into the hard indexes like in the old days. It's heaven. Most people don't realize how awful that was. It was awful. So I just love the electronic databases. And sometimes, almost all the time, I use an ancestry approach with footnote chasing, where I go and look at information within one article that seems important. And then a descendary approach, which then articles that cite pivotal studies and citation indexes so that they're descendants of something else. So that's very common what I do. And these are the ones I most often use, and I think when people work in a certain realm or topic, they develop theirs, what's important to them, like aging in place. This is what I use. So there's many different types of searches in e-databases: subject, text, word search, and author search. And I kind of actually do all of that all of the time, because you kind of get an understanding when you're working in a certain realm, like aging in place, who the hot people are writing about the topic. So you want to follow them on Twitter, first of all, so you get pre-release of their articles. And then I try to use text word search a lot, but that hasn't been as beneficial to me, but I think it's a really good way to start teaching students about the process. So keywords are very important, and I think probably everyone's had the librarian in your course at some point in time, where she comes and tries to help students understand keywords. So they don't have to be the same as subject headings in the database, because most programs are so well evolved and developed now that they have mapping capabilities. And I would say even in the last 2 years, that has changed significantly. It's just phenomenal. So in quantitative, keywords are typically independent and dependent variables, or the population. And in qualitative, it's usually a central phenomenon of interest in the population. It's just generically. And that's how I tell people to start. And once you start, it leads you somewhere else. It's a lot of fun. It's like a mystery dinner party. It's absolutely wonderful. So these are just some information about search tools, if you've never delved into the intricacies of doing that. But it's a lot of fun once you learn how to use them. And this is another example with Boolean operators and and/or and what the purpose of those are in the search engines. But it really does save you a lot of time once you learn how to use them. And there's also different types of literature. And I find a lot of students get confused about this. What's the difference between a theoretical literature and empirical literature? So evidence is evidence, and it's empirical, and that means someone along the way did some sort of study on something and found that A worked better than B, and it's then faced. Theory literature is basically concepts analysis, models, frameworks, and they're used or designed to support a selected problem or purpose. But it does confuse students a lot when they're initially doing reviews of literature or evidence, the difference between the two. So I always tell them a key factor is that empirical literature usually has some sort of data in it, in one way or another. It's kind of like a cue or a tip. And then this is the basic what most of us use to evaluate the quality of empirical evidence. It really helps students a lot, but I find they do get a little confused with case studies, pilot studies. So I kind of have a general rule, like when I taught in 691, no pilot, you need to give students parameters to it, helps them focus a little bit. And it's something, if you're going to write a systematic review and publish it, it's a determination you have to make as the author, if you're going to keep like a pilot study in or not, or if it's significant and important. So here's just examples of what all the empirical levels of evidence are. And most people, well, the problem with reading literature that's published is sometimes it's just not clearly stated by the writer, and it's published. So you got to like dig around, like what are they really talking about? And so that, I think, is the challenge. Other times you can clearly see this is a randomized control trial. So it's very clear. But a lot of times it's a little muddy in the writing. And I think everybody knows, because y'all have to write a lot, how hard it is to write. And so that can happen to any of us as writers or authors. So after the literature's identified, I really try to train people to do it in a methodical manner. Because if they don't, and I've seen this happen a lot with students, especially when they're big projects, like big scholarly projects, both grad and undergrad, they're like redoing over and over and over their literature reviews. And if it's not methodical and they didn't write down their keywords, they get like lost in the weeds. So basically, if something is screened and retrieved, I train people to keep a copy of the article. And it's usually just electronic. And then if they're going to actually, sometimes if I get 8,000 articles, I'm not going to read all the abstracts. It's just simply too much. So the first level would be just reading titles. If I'm just reading a title, I usually don't write down detailed information, because you're either keeping them or discarding them. But if you actually are reading an abstract, I like to start taking notes, and I usually do it within an Excel table or a Word table, so that you don't end up redoing work over and over and over again. It just saves time in the end. And then evaluated in terms of the quality of evidence the study yielded. So a lot of times that you'll either have a poorly written paper or a poorly written study or a poorly designed study. And so you can keep or delete anything within your review based on that. That's a very legitimate reason. So what I do if I find too many articles, I think, what is too many? Because you only have a certain amount of time to do this and capacity to read all these articles. So the first thing I do, and it can either happen too many or too little, and I kind of tell the students it's like a rubber band, and you either narrow your focus or broaden your focus. If you narrow, it limits your generalizability, so you have to think about that. You can do it based on variables, intervention, designs, date. If you're only looking at social determinants, just a certain type of population, there's many different ways of narrowing if you have a large number. And narrowing a focus is better than arbitrarily excluding studies. So it shows you're having a methodological approach to why you're actually eliminating. So when you go to analyze articles, integrating and synthesizing information across articles for a literature review has much in common with basically a qualitative analysis. And the focus is on identification of important themes. And so I hold the belief that a review is a form of research, because basically you're examining and researching all these other articles and considering doing something with them, either using it to conduct a project, to publish a paper, to design how you're doing something. So I've always looked at it as a form of research. Not everyone holds that belief, though. So a lot of times you get a variety of themes or patterns that can be pursued within these many different articles. And so substantive themes are, what is the pattern of evidence? How much evidence is there? How consistent is it? How persuasive is it? And are there key gaps in the body of evidence? So I like to train everyone to basically use consort charts. And so I get a lot of pushback. Like I just finished 5 projects with GAs. And they like, oh, this is a waste of time in the beginning. And then at the end, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I did that. Because what it really does is then you're basically writing down your method of doing this, and then you don't go back iteratively and get stuck redoing a method with just because you can't remember. This makes it be written down in front of you so that you can, did I do this or did I not do that? And so this is how I train people to take the total number of articles retrieved and from where. So if we have the 8,000, then I actually start with 8,000 because that's your big N. And then anything that doesn't meet the inclusion criteria and I reviewed in some way, whether it be title, abstract, or full paper, then I exclude those over to the, I guess it'd be your right. So that it's actually listed out why they're excluded. And I usually make like a little list, sub-list under that because I've learned by having to redo them personally over and over and over. That the more I write down when I'm doing this, it helps me not have to redo work. And then anything not relevant to the topic is also another reason where I exclude. And then you can see, then you end up with a group that's relevant to the topic. And then I look at secondary data sources within the papers I'm keeping. And again, come up with a new relevant to the topic number. But I do a final keep or not keep. And so like if I'm going to publish a systematic review, which I've done several times, I never do it solely. Like we sit in a group of 2 and often 3 and sometimes more and debate and argue what to keep and not keep and why. So that you have a valid reason. And I think that's something I can see that needs, we can evolve into that a little bit more with the DNP scholarly projects. Like why is this one, I tell this to the students, why is this one good enough to keep and why is this one not good enough to keep? What's your reason? So they have that critical thinking, which is what they do in patient care. I'm doing this for the patient instead of this. Why? So you're just answering here why. And you're writing it down so you don't have to go back and redo anything or remember. So then I also like to help people to be methodical and organized by doing a table. So this can be a little bit more challenging because within a table, you know, you have table column headers, and every review published has different column headers. So the column headers are really driven by your review, and it's very iterative what your columns are. And so there's no consistency with that. It's very individualized, just like patient care is individualized. What you're finding within a review that might be interesting is very individualized and could or could not be kept in a table. I usually suggest to people that they start and make like a massive table with a lot of columns, and then over time a column could be eliminated because it's just not interesting, you know? But a lot of times what is interesting, you end up with 8 or 10 columns in your table. But by starting big in your table and then eliminating later, you save yourself the time of having to go back and reread a bunch of articles again, which is very common with students. And so here's a good example of how to use a table to organize. It's basically the reference, the type of evidence, so that's the level, the number of people in the study, who is being studied. Key implications to me, a lot of times I focus on the nursing implications so I understand better how it applies to practice, but it depends on what you're working on. Everything is different. And then I like to always look at gaps listed in articles because that helps me see where the big need is, what's confusing, what would be a good thing to write about. So that's oddly a column I always, you could call it other, I guess. That's the other, but that's how I look at it, what gaps are. So every table is different. It just helps you organize and be methodical about reviewing literature that's published. So there's no rhyme or reason or best way to organize, but I do find listing the paper and the year in the first column is very helpful, because I have seen where people have had to go back and figure out where something came from, and they're pretty miserable. And then really I like to see the focus or purpose of whatever it is the article's about, because that gives you like a general idea. And then I like a lot to look at sample characteristics. Sometimes it's just the number in the study, their health state, like if they're CHF or cancer, what their gender is, their age, their minority distribution. And then I always like, because I'm very interested in minority work, minority low income work, to see if there's a big dropout rate. But that's just a personal interest of mine. So that's attrition. So I've been asked a lot by people, how do you report a conceptual framework like in a table like this? So it can be very challenging because a lot of journal editors don't allow authors space in articles to write about theories. So I would say more than likely the majority of nursing people use one, but you don't always find it published in the paper because that's the editor's preference. But a lot of times you'll see where they're stated. Sometimes you can kind of extrapolate, like especially if someone's doing self-efficacy with Bandura. It's an unstated theory, but you can kind of see what they're doing. Sometimes there's multiple theories. And a lot of times, and people are very surprised, I say, well, just email the author, and they'll tell you. And that's actually really effective, a good way to find out. I think it's important to think about what model, theory, or framework is used, because it kind of helps you see how they framed their work and to see if it actually should be kept or not kept for what you're working on. And I think study design is important, and that goes back to that pyramid where you're just listing what level of evidence something is. Because everyone, I think, knows a randomized control trial has higher level of evidence than a case control study or a cohort study. And that gets down to the question, like a lot of students think about this, what is evidence? What is enough evidence to say this is an evidence-based intervention or a procedure, you know? So this is something I think in the back of the person doing a review you have to somewhat think about. It's also very challenging to report about an intervention because, again, just like theories, frameworks, and models, not all journal editors allowed authors adequate space in an article to write about that. What it was, how much of it was done to people, how many times it was done, the timing of it, who was actually doing it. Was it a nurse or a CNA? Where it happened, at home or in the hospital? I mean, all of these things are very important. Like I did a big review years ago on hospital falls. Well, setting was very important there because if it's a community-based intervention, it more than likely may not have worked in the hospital setting. You know, so these things are very important, but again, they're very hard to pull out of articles often when you're conducting a review. And I always like to know if it was some sort of a tailored intervention where it's based on the individual and it's not always standardized as the same intervention. Because if I'm going to use their intervention or a part of it, I need to kind of know that because they might have modified it. And then I might not want to use it. I don't know. So I like to think about that. And then I always like to report about the concepts or variables and the measures so that I can kind of see what they were looking at. And then I'm kind of a stat geek, so I get the deep dive where I actually look to see if they're using valid tools. Like I commonly know what's the best thing to use in depression in older adults. Did they use the good thing from 10 years ago? I just kind of look at that. And then I think measurement timing is very important. So I like to understand that. Did they do it like now? Did they do it 5 days after the intervention? So it's kind of important because I deal a lot with elderly people and they can forget things. So the timing is very important to me. of when it's measured. And then I find a lot of times it's very difficult to report on results of all of the information that you're getting because it's not, again, always written real clearly in journal articles. I think there's been improvement over the last few years, and I think most of us know what's the best journal to look at in our respective interest areas. Just like with education materials, you kind of know what's good or bad to look at, which journals, so you get an idea. And so I like to have a whole big column in my tables about results, where I can actually see the statistics, and then what the actual p-value is, if there's an effect size reported, and then if they're looking at any secondary outcomes. So you can see I have massive tables when I first start. So p-values are very controversial because it's about chance, and it doesn't always indicate the magnitude of the observed effect. It's dependent on sample size and variability. It's really statistical versus practical importance. A lot of times studies are underpowered or overpowered. I've done both myself, just because of how much data you have or how much money you have. And so it's all relative to the actual article that you're reading. I like to look a lot at effect sizes because to me it's important if we're going to expend healthcare dollars, especially nursing time, because it's so very valuable, that it better have a pretty good darn effect on the people that you're doing it with, or what's the point of expending all of that time or energy. And that's just basically what effect size is. I did a fall prevention intervention, and it reduced falls by 20%. I'd be happy with that. But if it's 2%, why bother, So I actually look at that a lot. It's kind of like, in my mind, I'm thinking the value of the expenditure of the, usually nurses' time versus it's a return on investment. Time is time, and it's so very valuable. I love my general issues column, and that's where I write anything that doesn't fit into one of my other categories. And over time, I find that helps me identify when I need a new column, because I see trends within the general column. I personally look at limitations that are reported in articles, because sometimes that can eliminate it. Because they eliminated all, I work a lot with disability, so they didn't ask anybody disabled. Well, how good was that? So you really have to look at limitations of studies. So I get asked a lot about discursive prose versus annotated bibliography. Have many of you had to do an annotated bib? There's still some being used in the courses here in the college, but it's like my personal experience is that by tabling and doing a consort chart, I got more helpful information than doing an annotated bib, because it seems like annotated bibs are a resynthesis of the information that's already published. Does anybody have a different view of that? It's like an exercise. And I always have felt like pulling apart the information in that table helped me understand it better than restating what was already stated in the published article, which is kind of what an annotated bib is. So these are just some little tips. Writing up literature reviews really only needs to be done if you're going to put it in a scholarly paper or publish it, right? So if you're doing that, though, your material needs to be organized logically. And I like when everyone works from outlines so I can kind of see myself. But as you can see, like I've said that a lot of times, I'm very methodical about it. It's probably just my approach to doing it. And I think it helps me by being methodical. I can write more objectively and then re-summarize in my own words. So here's just an example of an outline, and I use this example very much similarly when students are first learning how to do posters. anything. It's kind of like a generic outline where you're reporting anything. And I think reporting on a review is very similar. And I just provided in here some examples of how you could summarize different sections of, if you have to ever write up a report of a review. And this is also some tips on summarizing theories and concepts. Like I usually list out, 5 people use Bandura, 4 people, that way. So that's very synthesized, so that I, as a reader, can get a good foci when I'm reading it on what the people out there are primarily doing in their approach. And the same is exactly true with methods, and that's a little bit more challenging to summarize. And the most challenging of all is the results. And I always try to save the most space for that. You try to inform the readers, but don't overwhelm them, and that's a big balance when you're writing up any type of a review. And I always caution people not to rely solely on p-values, just because it's less than, 0.05 doesn't mean it's actually important, significant, practical. So it's not the sole cut point you use on summarizing results. And I like emphasis on effect size, because on my mind, I'm always thinking about how much nursing time is this going to take? Is it practical? Can it really be done, If not, why talk about it? Why publish it? Why circulate it more? And in my mind, when I'm looking at the table, I try to look at consistencies across studies. And sometimes I'm thinking also in the back of my mind if I can link inconsistencies. Because I'm trying to make meaning of all of this so that I can understand it myself and talk about it. So here's just an example of how I go about summarizing effect sizes. And then a critical appraisal is an integrated or a separate section. It depends. Writing styles are different and editors are different in different journals. And it seems like I haven't seen a pattern yet with like the DMP final papers where there's a pattern here yet in the department. We all probably have one, like when we teach an individual course, a pattern, right? So I always talk a little bit about how to write an interpretation. So I think it's moving beyond describing results and what they mean and why they think the studies found something, like a reduced fall rate, for example. And I think it's very good to offer some sort of explanation why that happened. I think it's very important to be consistent when you're writing about results so that it's always reported in the same way every time, all of the time. So that you don't, and you've seen this, I'm sure, in student papers where they can circularly change exactly what they're looking at over time. So consistency is very important. And then evidence of absence versus absence of evidence is two very different things. And it's just something you have to think about when you're doing these kinds of reviews. And I actually have challenged a lot of the DMP students and even when I taught in 265, they have this wonderful problem that's huge in practice, and they want it solved, and there is no evidence. There's no evidence-based anything to work on the problem. That is so common when we go out and try to find some evidence, especially at the undergrad level. They have an awesome idea, but there's just no evidence. And I think of that differently. That could be evidence of absence or absence of evidence, right? We don't know. That's real critical thinking when people are thinking at that level. Then I always give tips on succinct writing strategies. I think focus is the most challenging thing. In every sentence, every paragraph, every section, it has to be sequential to make sense. And so I show my students, like when I teach at whatever level, how I deconstruct every sentence and every paragraph, and I take them apart and put them back together in Word so that they can see flow, meaning, and that it's going like from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. And they're always amazed, but then they write their paper, and then they come and see me afterwards because they want to do a rewrite. I said, well, did you do that? No. I said, well, let's just do that. One example. Can you see it now? And like they across the board always see it. And so for me, that's the way I can focus my paragraphs so that they get better flow, and then I focus a whole section that way. So it kind of fits together. So I love subheadings and transition statements, active voice, really like simple sentences where they don't run on for 84 words, and avoiding objective adjectives and strings of propositional phrases, which are very common with student writing. But it's really easy to do, isn't it? It's so easy to do. So here's some tips for writing. I think synthesis of the information, I think, is the key. And quotes, I always tell my students, that's someone else talking, not you. So you really have to not use them very, very sparingly in writing papers, reports, or any kind of publication, because that's someone else's words. Even if they cite it, it's still not their words, and that means they might not really understand it. So I kind of have a bias like that when I'm teaching, where students can't basically do that when I teach a class, because that means they just opened something up, cut and pasted it, put quotes around it, and did a nice APA citation. You have no idea if they understood it. So that's like one of my writing biases. And then discussing one article in a paragraph is not an acceptable approach. So John said, Joan said, Ralph said, oh my gosh, are those the worst papers to read? Awful, awful. And then I really have to work with a lot of people about not using your opinion. But if you have to, use it very sparingly when you're writing up systematic reviews. So I think some practice implications are you have to be consistent with results from studies. So you can't say this occurred in 10 other studies and this is what it really means, because it might not have meant that. So that's something you really have to think critically about. And we have to very much use caution when we have mixed findings in something. Trying to think on a student paper, we had like 10 good ones and 6 bad ones the other day. So the odds of 10 to 6 aren't all that great. So I'm sitting there and I said, well, would you do it or wouldn't you do it? Humming and hawing. So the class was like split, right? But nobody really knew except the person talking about it, because they knew the setting the best and the people that would actually be doing it or not. And they were kind of like on the ground expert and could decide that much better than me. It's just you have to decide, right? And you can't be kind of sneaky and eliminate the 6 bad ones. But you see this a lot, right? There's a lot of systematic reviews where only the good stuff is published. So it's just not real. And then being very specific. So there are some criteria for writing review articles. Prism is used a lot in Moose, and I put within here, like they're actually published procedures now that are accepted by journal editors about how to write up a review. And so it is necessary, while formulating the problems of which in our advance we are able to find the solutions, to call into counsel the views of those of our predecessors who have declared an opinion on the subject, in order that we may profit by whatever is sound in their suggestions and to avoid their errors. And if you think about it, that's what you're doing. You're doing like a historical look at what someone else said or did and what they felt about it, reinterpreting it into your own view within a review. So that it can be, like I publish because I like to help all those people that don't know how or don't have time, or to, like, it's amazing when I travel now how many people say, well, I read all of your articles. I'm like shocked all the time how many people say that, because people actually use published information at a very, very high level. It's very important. But even if it's a publication within a scholarly project of an undergrad and a grad, and Janet and I have actually talked about why aren't we putting the undergrad final project out in ScholarWorks. We had that conversation, and I have not had enough time to think about that yet. I mean, the master's and the graduate students are published, and there's some very high-level undergrad student work being done that could help someone else out in the world. You know, especially in the countries where they don't have a lot of assets or ability to work on those kind of things. So that's something we'll talk about over time when we have time. But really, that's what it is. That's what dissemination's about. And there's all different kinds of ways of going about doing reviews. And there's all different kinds of reviews. And I think the key is to really think about being methodical about it. I think that's the most important. It makes it more scholarly, usable, interesting, practical, and it helps someone else think and learn from it, I think, when it's more methodical. So, are there any questions? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I started to use the scholars more of the database, and one trick I use to learn from the area is that if you log into the BSC library and click on the key, go on the Google Scholar, you have access to a lot more articles than you do in the
Okay, so Susan Strauss was just sharing with us, if you go into GVSU and click on the G for Google Scholar, that you'll get a more robust Google Scholar. I am telling all my students, because I already love Google Scholar. I absolutely love that. So that is wonderful to know, because almost all my students now, and I regularly use Google Scholar. The analytics are wonderful. It's a good starting point, and sometimes it helps me get things I don't have to pay for, which is really important to me. I kind of don't like to pay for any articles. Any other questions or helpful suggestions? That was really, I'm going to tell all my students that. I'll never forget that tip. That's very important. Yes, they are in KCON Connect. And all of the four, we're doing 4, SEC and I are doing 4 sessions this year on faculty scholarship development. So on the very bottom here, I added it, faculty scholarship development. And then if you click on that, each of the 4 dates will have their own folder. And then both the handouts and the PowerPoint are here. And you can use them for whatever would be helpful for you to use. Classes, students, whatever is helpful. And you have permission to modify the PowerPoint in any way you see would be beneficial for your use from me. So I left it in its real format. It's not PDF, so you could actually not have to retype anything. Well, that's annoying.
I have one integrated review in revision right now, and one of the reviewers commented that they wanted more specific information about study results. And like you said, when I looked at the results, there isn't a lot of information about the investment. And so I use the level, but I can't say how much the MMS changed or how much the instruments that they use to exercise so I'm not quite sure where to go with what the reviewer is asking. I guess only to say that the articles did provide more information.
So the question is on editor's review of a manuscript to be published, they gave the feedback that they wanted more results. And so basically what you have is articles that don't have any more results. And so what I would do is make that a more explicit limitation within your section, which is usually the last paragraph in your results or your limitation, and then point that out and see if you hit the question or not, because it might not be clear what the question really is. But that's where I would probably start, because you don't have any more results. So kind of like the question was the effect size, which is the amount of change included, and a lot of people don't do the thing that I love, so that I can decide, is it worth expending all the energy to make the improvement or not. And a lot of people don't report on effect size. Yep. But they don't say it made 10% improvement, 20% improvement. And that's almost more important than the p-value, because it takes so many resources. Yep. So she asked about sample size, and I think what you do that again in your limitation section is note that as a limitation, but that there are no larger studies available at this point in time, but it would be beneficial if they were. That's all you can say. It's a challenge. You can see it's a juggling act. See if that's the right question or not from the editor. Okay, any other questions? So we will also be posting the electronic, so that other faculty, and if you would so like, any of the DMP students who are RNs could obtain CEUs for this. And Carol Rausch, and this is wonderful, I announced earlier that today is our first CNL exam at KCON. So she's the exam proctor. But she will be sending out a Survey Monkey so that you can evaluate the program today and get your CEU certificate. And our next session is on pain in older adults, and I didn't write down the date, January, early January. Darn it all. So that we can all have our pain CEU met for the year. And we'll do the same thing if you can't be in attendance, and it'll be posted in this section of KCON Connect. So you can just click on it and do that process to get your pain CEU. Yep. Thank you, everybody. And please take any leftovers that you would like. We have a beautiful FTLC grant to support our food for the program.